The bear returned years later. What he did left everyone in tears. The forest was always a place of peace for Daniel, a quiet man who had lived most of his life on the edge of the wilderness. His cabin stood alone among the tall pines, far from the noise of cities, where the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the distant calls of wild animals. To him, the woods weren't dangerous. They were alive, filled with stories only those who listened could hear. It was during one of his routine walks that he first saw the bear cub. The little creature was trembling beside a fallen log, its dark eyes filled with both fear and curiosity. Daniel froze at first, knowing that approaching a wild animal, even a cub, could be dangerous. Where there was a cub, a mother was never far. But as the minutes passed, it became clear, the cub was alone. Something inside Daniel stirred. He could have walked away, told himself it was nature's way, but instead, he crouched down at a safe distance and placed a piece of bread on the ground. To his surprise, the cub crept forward cautiously, sniffed, and then snatched the food before darting back. Daniel smiled. It was a small moment, but something powerful had begun. Over the next days, Daniel returned to the same spot. Each time, the cub would be waiting. Slowly, trust replaced fear. The cub began to approach him more openly, brushing against his boots, even letting him gently touch its fur. In that quiet forest clearing, man and beast formed an unlikely bond, one that neither of them could have imagined would change both their lives forever. What began as cautious encounters soon turned into a daily ritual. Each morning, Daniel would walk into the woods with a small pack of food, not much, just scraps of bread, berries, or fish he'd caught from the stream nearby. The cub, who once trembled in fear, now bounded toward him with playful energy, its clumsy paws tripping over roots and stones. Daniel laughed each time, amazed at how quickly this wild creature had learned to trust him. Weeks turned into months, and the cub grew stronger. Its once tiny frame filled out, and its fur glistened under the sunlight. Daniel noticed how the cub would follow him through the forest, as though he were its protector. Sometimes it even tried to imitate him, standing on two legs, scratching at tree bark while Daniel chopped wood. To Daniel, it felt less like caring for an animal and more like raising a companion. Their bond was not just built on food, but on presence. Daniel would sit on the porch of his cabin in the evenings, watching the sky turn shades of orange and purple. The bear would sit beside him, silent yet strangely comforting. At night, when the forest grew colder, Daniel could hear soft rustling outside his cabin window, the bear settling close, almost as though it wanted to guard him. But it wasn't always playful. Once, when a pack of coyotes ventured too close, Daniel watched in awe as the cub, no longer small but not yet fully grown, stood its ground, growling fiercely until the predator scattered. It wasn't just Daniel protecting the bear anymore. The bear, in its own way, had become Daniel's protector too. Together, they shared the rhythm of the forest, the passing of seasons, the harsh winters, and the blooming springs. And with each passing day, Daniel realized that this bond was no longer temporary. This bear had become a part of his life, his family, his very soul. Time in the forest flowed quietly, but nothing lasts forever. As the cub grew into a strong young bear, Daniel began to notice the subtle changes. The playful visits became less frequent. Some mornings, the bear didn't come at all. When it did, it would linger at the edge of the trees, watching him from a distance rather than bounding forward. Daniel knew deep inside what it meant. The bear was no longer a cub. The wild was calling it back, calling it to the life it was meant to live, far from the presence of humans. And though Daniel had known this day would come, the realization still cut deep. One autumn evening, Daniel sat on his porch, a piece of bread in his hand, just like the very first day. The bear appeared at the treeline, its massive frame silhouetted against the setting sun. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The bear's dark eyes held his, full of a quiet understanding. Then slowly, it stepped forward and came close. Daniel reached out, resting his hand against the thick fur, memorizing the warmth, the strength, the life that pulsed beneath. There were no words, only silence broken by the soft rustle of leaves. Then, with one final look, the bear turned and walked into the forest. Daniel watched until the shadow disappeared, swallowed by the trees. That night, the cabin felt unbearably empty. Daniel lay awake, hearing only the distant calls of the forest and the echo of memories, the cub's first hesitant steps, its playful growls, the way it had once sat beside him in quiet companionship. He had lost a friend, a guardian, a piece of himself. But even as sadness pressed on him, Daniel whispered into the darkness. "You'll always find your way back. I'll be here." Little did he know, those words would one day come true in the most unexpected way. Years slipped away like the flowing river near Daniel's cabin. Life moved on, but the memory of the bear never left him. Sometimes, in the stillness of dawn, he thought he heard familiar rustling outside the window, only to find nothing but the whisper of wind. He grew older, his hair turning silver, his steps slower, yet his eyes always glanced toward the tree-line, hoping. One crisp spring morning, nearly 10 years after their last meeting, Daniel was chopping wood when the forest fell strangely quiet. Birds hushed their songs, and even the breeze seemed to pause. He turned, sensing something. And there, at the edge of the clearing, stood a massive shadow. For a moment, Daniel's heart stopped. It was a bear, towering and powerful, with scars across its thick fur, the kind of scars only years in the wild could leave. But it wasn't just any bear. Those eyes, deep, dark and familiar, locked onto his, and Daniel knew instantly. It was his bear. The years melted away in an instant. Daniel dropped his axe, his throat tight with emotion. Slowly, he took a step forward, uncertain if the bond they once shared had survived time and distance. The bear stood still, watching him. Then, to Daniel's astonishment, it lowered its massive frame and let out a soft, almost rumbling sound, not a growl of warning, but a sound of recognition. Daniel's eyes blurred with tears. Against every instinct, he moved closer, and the bear didn't retreat. When he finally stood just a breath away, the bear nudged him gently with its snout, the same way it had done years ago when it was still a cub. Daniel laughed through tears, resting his hand once again on the familiar fur. The forest, the years, the silence, none of it had broken the bond. The bear had remembered. And in that moment, Daniel understood, this was not just a reunion. It was a promise kept, a friendship that had survived the test of time. The reunion was nothing short of a miracle, but what truly shook Daniel wasn't just that the bear had returned, it was the way it looked at him. Those dark, soulful eyes weren't wild with hunger or instinct. They were calm, deep, and filled with something Daniel could only describe as recognition and gratitude. The bear lingered near the cabin for hours that day. Daniel brought out water and set it in a large basin, the same way he once had for the little cub. To his amazement, the bear drank without fear, just as it had years ago. It then lay down in the grass, watching him with an intensity that sent chills down his spine. Daniel sat beside it, feeling the weight of years fall away. He realized then that the bear hadn't just come back for comfort, it had come back with a message. Its presence spoke louder than words. You mattered. You saved me. And I never forgot. As the afternoon sun painted the forest gold, Daniel reached out and touched the thick fur again. His hand trembled, not with fear, but with reverence. The bear didn't move. Instead, it lifted its head slightly and held Daniel's gaze with an expression so human-like, it broke him inside. He saw loyalty. He saw memory. He saw a silent thank you that no creature had ever given him before. Daniel whispered, voice thick with emotion. I thought you were gone forever, but you came back. You remembered me. The bear blinked slowly, almost as if answering. And for Daniel, that was enough. The encounter was brief, but unforgettable. When the bear finally rose and turned toward the woods, it paused one last time, locking eyes with him again. In that look was everything, love, gratitude, and the unspoken bond that defied time, distance, and even nature itself. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. The forest outside felt alive with memory, and though the bear had gone, its message remained imprinted on his heart forever. The forest eventually grew quiet again, but Daniel was no longer the same man who once sat alone in his cabin. The bear's return had awakened something in him, a truth he had long forgotten. The bonds we form, no matter how unlikely, leave echoes that last a lifetime. Word spread quickly through the nearby town. Neighbors whispered about the ranger who had once raised an orphaned cub, only for it to return years later, remembering him like an old friend. Many dismissed it as legend, a story exaggerated by time. But Daniel didn't care whether anyone believed. He knew what he had seen in the bear's eyes, and that truth lived inside him like a flame. He began keeping a journal, writing down every memory, from the first night the cub followed him home, to the painful day of its departure, and finally, the miraculous reunion. The pages became a record not just of events, but of feelings, the loneliness that had been broken, the healing that had begun, and the love that had transcended species. Sometimes, late at night, Daniel would sit on the porch and gaze at the tree-line. He never knew if the bear would come again, but that no longer mattered. The bond had already been sealed. The silence of the forest no longer felt empty. It was alive with the presence of a friend he might never see again, but would always feel. Years later, when Daniel's own life began to wane, locals remembered him as the quiet man who shared his soul with the wild. And though many stories faded with time, one truth remained. Somewhere in that vast forest, a bear had once looked at a man with eyes full of memory and gratitude. And that was the legacy Daniel left behind. Proof that love and kindness, even in the most unlikely of places, are never forgotten.